here we are with a brand new position, and we are gonna talk about the third key characteristic. So far we've talked about king safety, we've talked about anything that is undefended or poorly defended, and now we're moving on to the third of 4 points, and this one has to do with pieces that can be trapped. Especially if your opponent has a piece in, say, your half of the board, then there is a greater likelihood that you might trap a piece. But in fact, anywhere in the board, you can trap a piece. And here is one great example. The black queen seems to be okay here, but in fact, white can trap it. The problem is that black, at the moment, he can go either to g5 or to b4. That's only 2 squares that the queen can go to right now. And therefore, white can play the move pawn to b4, that's what he did, and immediately white is winning. Why? Well, when I said that black can trap the queen, I wasn't being entirely truthful. The fact of the matter is that black can escape with his queen. He could go queen to g5, for example. By the way, the threat that he's escaping is the move knight to f3, which would attack the queen and take away the g5 square. So it is possible for the queen to move. The problem is that if the queen goes, say, to g5 immediately, then white can win in a number of ways. One of them is rook to g3. With the move rook to g3, he is attacking the queen, and if the queen steps away, say to h4, then white can at the very least grab a full rook. And still the queen will have some problems, because on the next move, if white is allowed, he will play the move knight to f3. And you may notice that there, the black queen continues to be trapped. So queen to g5 is not an option. What about bishop takes e4? Well, in that event, then still knight to f3. And it's true, now black can capture the knight, but after rook takes queen, we see that black has lost the queen anyway. In the game, black did indeed capture on e4, and after knight to f3, he went queen to f5. So he found the only square to keep his queen. But the problem goes back to what we've been talking about a short while ago, which is, we said, undefended points in a position, that's pieces, pawns, and squares. And we also said what we can call loose points in a position, which is any point that is attacked and defended the same number of times. So for example, we notice this pawn on d6 now is a hanging pawn because we're attacking it with our rook and with our queen. And it's only got one defender, and that's the king. So white continued with the move rook takes d6 check. If we actually step back to this position, we see that the point on d6 was defended twice and attacked twice, and therefore, for now, the d6 point is okay. But the second that white played this move knight f3 and challenges the queen on e5, and so the queen has to move, the second that that occurs, queen f5, suddenly the point falls immediately. And so we see that importance of points that are loose. We may also notice, by the way, that this bishop on e4 is attacked once, and once again, only defended one time. So if you are able to either add an attacker to the point or remove the defender, in this case the queen, then the bishop on e4 will be in trouble. White continued with the move rook takes d6 check. The king stepped away, and now knight to d4, attacking the queen once more. The queen stepped away, and now queen c3 check. We see that initially the tactic worked based on the threat of trapping the queen. And black somehow struggled on and found a way to keep his queen on the board. But after bishop to c7, then in this position, White, actually, he continued with the move pawn to f3, a very strong grandmaster, and this was absolutely a good enough move. But White also had quite a nice option of the move knight to h5. And the idea behind this move is, if you notice, the rook, the queen, and the bishop, they're all arranged very dangerously for a knight that may land on f6, and guess what? This pawn is undefended. So we have several ways in which White could continue the game. f3 was a very, very good move, and White won shortly after, but knight h5, targeting this point, would have been quite strong as well. And in fact, it's very, very hard to come up with a good defense for Black. But what started it all was that in this position, the Black queen only had a couple of squares to go to. Pawn went to b4, took away one of those squares, and the other point is that once this knight is removed, we see that the d6 pawn is not undefended, but we can say it's quite fragile. It's quite vulnerable to attack, because the second that that knight was removed, we saw that the number of attackers on that point was 2, the rook and the queen, and the number of defenders was also 2, the queen and the king. And since the queen couldn't continue to perform its role, its defensive role, the point fell, and then the Black king became very weak, and White won shortly thereafter. So in fact, with this, we have talked about 3 of the big points: king safety, undefended, and not so well defended, we'll call them loose points. Pieces that can be trapped. These are all things to consider and characteristics of any given position that will lead to many tactical opportunities. And the final one is one that we actually just saw a very, very short while ago when we suggested the move knight to h5. And what I call this one is, in fact, I'm not exactly sure what the best term is for it, so I flip around, but let's call it when pieces are sitting ducks, right? Let's look at it like this. So what do I mean by this? Well, we saw that after the move knight to h5, if Black, say, does nothing, right? Let's say a move like rook to a7, knight takes f6, and we see how many targets the knight can have. And the reason why this is going on is because of the way that the pieces are placed, the way that they're arranged. You have them all within striking distance of a knight on f6. If I asked you in this position, tell me the square where you can place a knight that will attack this rook, this queen, and this bishop, you would tell me f6. And if I said to you, okay, give me another square, you would say there is no other square. So strong chess players, what they do is they think about, oh, well, what is, the magic square that I can place any given piece on, and that will lead to some tactics. So for a knight and this rook, queen, and bishop, it is in fact the f6 square. But what if I asked you the question of, for a knight and this king and rook? Well, then you wouldn't place the knight here on f6. Instead, you would place the knight on e7. What if I asked you for a pawn and this rook and the bishop? Then you would say, well, if I could get a pawn to b6, then that would fork the rook and the bishop. So this is the 4th characteristic that you should keep in mind. Look at how the pieces are arranged and try and figure out if there is any important square from where you can create multiple threats, right? Because there is no denying that tactics and threats are very, very closely connected topics, because in order for a tactic to be successful, you have to create threats that overwhelm the opponent, right? That you threaten 2 or 3 different things. Like here, for example, you're creating a threat against the rook on g8, one against the queen on h7, and one against the bishop on e4. And Black simply doesn't have enough time to deal with all of them.